Hey all, I appreciate you all being honest with me yesterday about saying that you feel a little lost whenever I ask you to write about this poem for the week, Say My Name. And it made me think about maybe how we should think about writing for poetry is really similar to how we should think about writing for art in general. And so I have a couple thoughts I thought I would share them with you. And so just follow along as I try and make this understandable, get it out of my head a little bit. I think that most people are, when they say they are confused about writing about poetry, they're maybe actually confused about what does it mean to write about art. And when we say art, it could mean a bunch of things. Art could be memes even, but it could be poems like yesterday. It could be books, it could be music, it could be visual art, and we'll actually do a fair amount of writing about some or maybe even all of these things as the year gets going on. But what does it mean to write about art in general? That's a big question, and it kind of leads us to this idea about, well, what is even art? What qualifies as art, or what are the qualities of art? We kind of wonder if we're going to be writing about it, then maybe we need to understand, well, what is art after? And I really like this article, or this quote by a guy named Paul Klee. He was a visual artist, and he said this. He said that art does not reproduce the visible. Rather, art makes visible. That's a weird thing to say. Art does not reproduce the visible, but instead makes visible. And I think in short what he's after is this idea that art, when we do it, when people do it, what people are after is that they are trying to say things in the truest way they know how. They're trying to provide us with an awareness of how things really are. And so art is really not so much after helping us understand what something is like. It's not about reproducing what we know our lives to be. Rather, art actually helps us to understand how the world really is. So it makes sense then that books or music or visual art or poems or memes or whatever it is, that these things may not be written, probably are not written like a news story in a paper or online, that they are creative, that they try and help us to see things in a new way, and they do that by maybe even breaking some rules or following their own set of rules. And poetry really is about that. That's why a lot of people have trouble with poetry, is because it's confusing or it doesn't make sense or they don't understand how the pieces are fitting together. But if we think about poetry as just an explanation of this quote by Paul Klee, that poetry is really not about helping us or reproducing how we understand our lives to be, but rather poetry is about explaining, it is about creating, actually. It's about creating a way to see the world. Now, this may be through, your experience, but it's also probably, if you read enough, it should be about others' experiences too. As we even understand our own experience, it can help us understand each other's as well. So let's go back up to this question though. What does it mean to write about art? What is the goal when we say we are writing about art? Well, we're actually in some ways trying to put this quote in reverse, because we're trying to make sense of what this art has done. This art has made something visible, and we need to make sense of what that is. So when we write about art, when we're writing about art, to write about art is to make the invisible visible. There's so many things in a poem. There's so many things in the ways that art is written that helps us to understand what it means to be alive, or what it means to be in love or connected with someone, or to understand how people work, to understand how the world works, or what it means to be connected with each other or with this place. But to write about it, we're trying to then make sense of that. We're trying to connect the dots. We're trying to connect the dots between what is invisible, what we can't see, to what we can. Because life is confusing. Life is hard to understand. Life oftentimes does not work in a straight line. But we can explain that. And it's a hard task, but our goal is to explain how the art form, in this case of poetry, helps us to, our goal is to explain how those pieces are working. We're trying to make the invisible visible. So let's go to this. What are the invisible elements of poetry? Well, the invisible elements of poetry probably are things like this. They're things like a theme, themes, or tone, or point of view, or perspective. All these things are emotionally based. All these things are based around how someone can either write a poem. It's about the author, but it's equally, and I would even argue more, about the reader. Through reading a piece of poetry, we understand maybe a theme, maybe a takeaway idea. Maybe some sort of tone, we can feel it in the poem. We can understand a new point of view, or we can understand a new perspective. These things, though, are invisible. You can't quite touch them. You can't touch a feeling. You can't touch a theme. You can't touch a point of view. But writing is written down, of course, right? There are words, there are letters, there are sounds on a page. And so the visible elements is where we have to put our ideas, where we have to focus on. So the visible elements of a poem, for instance, are the things that you've been learning for several years now. Things like imagery, things like word choice, things like structure, things like juxtaposition, sound. All these things you've spent a whole lot of time learning as you've grown in school. And so our goal is to say, well, how am I feeling as I read this? What is something that I now understand better, either about me because of these things in the poem, the invisible elements of the poem, or maybe about who the author is, who the speaker is in the poem. But the way that you go about explaining that is you have to tie it. You have to tie these things together, these invisible elements. You have to tie them to the visible choices that are within the poem. How do you know that this poem is discussing this kind of theme? How do you know that the speaker is irritated or defiant, or has a sense of power, or has a sense of realization, What do you feel like is the overarching message of this poem? What is it getting at? What's important that's being said? Well, you prove that. You prove that you know that by just connecting these two things. How do you prove perspective in a poem? How do you prove point of view or tone or a theme? Well, you connect it. You touch on the imagery in it. You touch on the word choice in it, or how the poem is organized, or what two things are being opposed, and how does that help us understand these big ideas? How is the sound of the poem contributing to our understanding of who the speaker is, or who we are after reading it? That's what good writing about poetry does. That's what good writing about art does, is that it connects the invisible feelings, the things we can't touch, to the things that we can, the words on the page.